Hi friends, it's Casey. Welcome back to another art journal spread. Today we are going to do this color palette, which is mostly grays and then a blue. For some reason, two of them are labeled charcoal, even though they're two different colors, so I don't know what's up with that. I've already gessoed my pages. One of these pages is a glossy page from like a catalog, and I've figured out a way to gesso it so that the gesso doesn't come off when I use water. I did a clear gesso coat first and then white gesso, and I actually did a coat of white paint over the top of all of that, and it worked out really well. So today we're going to start with some watercolors, which normally I don't do a whole lot of watercolor, especially on gessoed pages, because it just has a weird effect because it can't soak into the page. But I got some brand new watercolors. I got some Gansai Tembi colors and then a set of Fine Tech pearlescent mica watercolors. So we're going to experiment with those today. So I've got three colors of the Gansai Tembi and then kind of a blue-gray with the mica watercolor. And I'm just applying some on top of the gesso. And because it doesn't soak in, it just kind of sits there and it's kind of weird. You'll see me with my little tweezers there. I had gotten a set of watercolor brushes at a garage sale. They were brand new. I got them for $2, and they're Japanese calligraphy style brushes, and they were terrible. This is the first time I used them, and the bristles kept coming out all over the place, and you'll see me several times trying to get bristles off the page. And halfway through, I just gave up and used my water brush instead, and after this, I threw out those calligraphy brushes. They were just awful. Get what you pay for, I guess. It was $2. The person I got them from had gotten them as a gift, so I really knew nothing about the brushes. They're not labeled, they were just in a box. So I've got my blue all set. After I had done the first layer, if I had left it and just done kind of a really watery wash, I could have gone over it with black ink and done some of marks that way. And it would have been quite a bit of a different outcome than what I finished with. But I did want really saturated colors, so I went over again and darkened the color up. And I'm using my white acrylic marker, and we're just making marks. There was really no rhyme or reason for this. I started out with some circles. I did overlap some of the circles just for interest. I had been watching some YouTube videos of other collage artists and mixed media artists, and there was one artist in particular who was doing a lot of mark making on top of watercolor, and I thought it was really cool, so I wanted to try that. Of course, it's very different when you do it on watercolor paper, and the watercolors can soak into the paper, because then the marks that you make over the top show up a lot more. This really wasn't the effect that I had in mind when I had started out, but I think it turned out okay in the end. There's kind of a fine line between chaos and being something that turned out cool. And I think I walked that line okay. When you first look at it, it's just kind of a mess of everything. But the more you look at it, the more you can see the actual marks that I've made, and the more you kind of discover. So it was a fine line to walk, but I think I did it all right. It helps to have the white background and not have the color go all the way to the edges of the page. This marker I chose because it was gray, but it's not actually gray, it's a metallic silver. And then these pens that I'm using now are glitter pens. So between the Fine Tech mica pearlescence and the glitter pens and the metallic markers. There's quite a bit of sparkle and shine in this piece. Here I'm just kind of making defined edges to some of these watercolor shapes. At this point I was just winging it because the watercolors weren't, like I said, soaking into the page, so the marks over the top were kind of getting a little bit lost. And so I just kind of decided to go with whatever I felt like doing. And I like defining the edges of these shapes because it's kind of like when you do watercolor and you have a lot of color in the middle of a section and then it kind of gets darker towards the edge as it dries. That's the effect that I was going for here. And since it didn't really do that too much on its own, I decided to help it along with the pen. I'm also kind of going around some of these circles just to define them a little bit more and make them more visible. Art is such a neat process because even if you're copying what someone else is doing, you come up with something that's uniquely your own. I don't think two people could really do anything quite the same way. Art really gets into your personality and what you like and what you're made of and how you see the world. And it comes through in what you create. And so it's completely different for everybody. Sometimes the hardest part with art is just letting go and being yourself. Doing what you feel like doing and not trying to copy someone else or make it look professional or impressive. Just to let go and do art that's you. I think for so many people, and creatives especially, it can be really hard to let other people really see who you are, because if they reject your work, it's kind of like they're rejecting you on a personal level. And sometimes that's the case, but most often it's not. It's just something that they don't vibe with, and that's all. It's not really a reflection on you. And even if it is, I mean, there are people you don't like and people's work that you don't like, even if you like them as a person, and we all have different tastes. And there's always going to be somebody out there who likes your stuff and appreciates you, and there's still going to be a lot of people too who don't like your work but still like you as a person. So creating art, and especially showing it to other people, that's really a huge act of bravery. But I think it's a really good way to find your people. The people that you're really going to connect with. So I'm taking my 2-hands ink pen and just making some little botanicals here, just kind of a stick with some leaves on it. I wanted something organic. It's early summer, and I tend to draw a lot of seasonal kinds of things. So when it's fall, I really bring out the seasonal colors and, the pumpkins and the leaves and that kind of thing. And in the winter, it's a lot of kind of whites and blues and purples. And once we get into spring and summer, I like to do a lot of botanicals. I draw a lot of inspiration from nature. I've always really been drawn to nature. I grew up in a city. It was a suburb of a big city. I had a few trees in my backyard, but it was a lot of highway and power lines. But I've always been a nature girl at heart. There's just something I connect with. I do like cityscapes when people draw cities. I think it's really neat because I don't have a lot of exposure to that. I do live out in the country now, and I've lived in very small towns for most of my adult life. And that's really where I feel at home. I do like cityscapes, but it's not something I keep in my house and not something I personally draw very often. I use my Posca and then I'm using my other acrylic markers. I'm trying to make these white squares and the page just was not having it. I kept picking up the watercolor from underneath it, so ultimately I decided to use acrylic paints instead. These are golden fluid acrylics. I have had things like Liquitex Basics, I've had heavy body paints. I recently just kind of got rid of all of my paints except for the liquid. I have a couple liquid acrylics and I have mostly fluid acrylics. So I just really like working with the fluidity a lot better. This is a Payne's Gray. When I paint with acrylics, I don't really use black very often. I almost always use Payne's Gray, just because black is such a strong color, and the Payne's Gray is a little more subtle. And I put these kind of dots, sesame seeds, whatever you want to call them, in there, and even with the Payne's Gray, it was a little too dark, so I did go back over and touch them some, pull up some of the paint and help them become more background and not, hey look, I'm a sesame seed. So I've got my background basically finished and I got this book of birds at a garage sale for like $1, and the drawings in it are really cool. I knew I would find all kinds of uses for this, so I picked it up and I'm going to put this bird in on the corner in the bottom there where it's really blank. And I'm going to put a piece of scrapbook paper behind it, because just sticking the bird on there, I think it would probably get lost because the background is pretty busy. And then I decided to put this piece of paper in there. Now this is just a black piece of paper that I got in a pack from Walmart of scrap paper. And I took one of my acrylic paint pens and I just made marks on it. And I've been waiting to use it for quite a while, and I thought this was a good opportunity. This particular piece of paper isn't quite as blue as I had wanted it to be. I wanted it a little bit more of a turquoise, but beggars can't be choosers, and that was the closest color I could come up with. Especially one without a pattern on it. I didn't need another pattern on top of the busy background. Now this blue piece, I just happened to glance over into my little paper box over here, and it was sitting on the top, and I thought, it's close enough, so we'll add that in as well. I decided here to go with the dots rather than the kind of brick pattern. And because I've got 2 squares, this time I'm making a circle, because variety is the spice of life. I did fussy cut this bird. I did not completely fussy cut all the little branches. I just kind of basically went around and went close to it, but not really fussy cutting it. It came out close enough. It didn't really make too much of a difference. Because of the light blue square there, having some white around that branch really doesn't show up enough to count for anything, so it was good enough. Sometimes you just have to drop that perfectionism and say, good enough. I've been a perfectionist pretty much all of my life, but because I have chronic illness and I get exhausted a lot and my brain doesn't function all the time, good enough has really become a big thing for me. And that's really what I like about art journaling too, is you can play around and you can say, good enough. It's not like you're going to submit it to hang in a museum. And honestly, I think the more good enough I do and the less it has to be perfect that I do in my art, I think the better that my art is. Things that are perfect are boring. I think that turned out really nice because of the more solid colors in the squares. It sets off that bird so it doesn't get lost in the background. And we're just going to add a little bit of shadow with the Stabilo pencil. I tend to always put shadows on the same sides. I'm not really sure why. I don't actually think too hard about where the light source is coming from. I just do what feels like it should be done. And I'm right-handed, but I do a lot of things left. Like I will cartwheel left, if you know anything about gymnastics. And I do use my left hand quite a bit, so I tend to put shadows on the bottom and on the left side. And I'll take a little bit of water and soften that up a little bit. I keep a spray bottle on my desk all the time, and I use it particularly for things like this, when I just need a little bit of water. It's very handy. I don't have to get up and go into the bathroom or the kitchen to get water all the time, so I recommend keeping a spray bottle at your art space, just because it's so convenient. And it's good for things like, when you clean your palette, or I don't know, other things. Nothing's coming to mind at the moment. The brain just quit working mid-gear. adding drop shadows is really important to make things pop off the page, and it just brings it all forward, so you know, hey, this is the focal point. I'm using my white Jelly Roll pen to just do a couple of flower shapes in this blue square. It's kind of hard to see it right here on the camera. I didn't want to do an acrylic paint marker because I wanted it to be more into the background than the bird, and so I didn't want those white flowers to be like really white and draw too much attention. I'm just drop shadowing those little white squares. And I'm taking my blue outline marker, which is, it's a silver in the middle and then it has blue toward the edges. And my little fancy schmancy scissors. And I'm doing my word. I thought shine was a good word for this one because of all the metallics. I'm dating myself, but I used to have one of these outline markers when I was in the 5th grade. They don't stink nearly so much now as they did back then. I think the one I had back then was blue too. I have a whole set of them now, different colors, but I think the one I had back then was blue. And there it is, all finished. I hope you can see all the little sparkles and metallics in there. Thanks for joining me. I'll see you next time.